The summer the valley floor cracked open, like old porcelain. Every man who had laughed at Marin Soli had the same dream, that the water she found beneath her land was already spoken for by somebody richer and smoother than he was. They were half right about the water and entirely wrong about the somebody. On the morning the Consolidated Range Company sent its third representative to her gate, the whole of Dry Willow Valley turned out along the fence line, hats in hands, faces drawn down by 6 weeks of rainless sky, and watched to see what a woman alone would do with the only thing standing between 100 families and ruin. The heat that day was not the ordinary dry heat of a high summer. It pressed like the open door of a furnace left ajar. The Consolidated man, a fellow named Aldridge, who wore a linen shirt still somehow white, stood at the gate and offered Marin a sum that represented the largest single number most of the onlookers had ever heard spoken aloud in conversation. She listened to the whole figure. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would speak to the valley, not to him, and she turned back toward the goats. It was not the first time she had turned her back on Edwin Aldridge. It would be the last. What the valley did not know, and what the heat and the shame of 6 weeks without water were only beginning to teach them, was that Marin Solis had been answering that same question, "What will you do?" since the first morning she drove her truck through Dry Willow's single stoplight 14 months earlier. In a spring cold enough to make the budding cottonwoods look apologetic, she had answered it without language, with labor, and with something that most of the valley had been too busy or too proud to recognize as intelligence: patience. The land had been waiting for someone with enough stillness to hear it. Marin was that kind of still. She had come from Tucson with $4,000 remaining of the $9,000 she had inherited from her grandmother. A topographic survey she had bought for 50 cents at an estate sale 3 years prior, and the stubborn conviction that the survey meant something the previous owners had been too conventional to imagine. The land she purchased, 83 acres, in the least regarded corner of Dry Willow Valley, a tilted parcel of rocky caliche and scrub juniper that everyone called the Ledge, had sold for $3,600 because no lender would touch it and no rancher wanted it. The deed transfer happened at the county clerk's office on a Tuesday, with only the clerk and Marin present. The seller, an elderly man named Hurston, who had inherited it and never once walked it, shook her hand and said he hoped she knew what she was doing. She told him she was learning. She drove out to the Ledge that afternoon and sat on the hood of her truck for an hour, watching the topography. The land tilted toward a shelf of fractured limestone that the survey had labeled, in faint penciled notation, as a possible seep zone, historic. No water had been visible there in anyone's living memory. The notation had been made in 1931 by a surveyor named Espinosa, who had apparently been ignored. Marin ate the sandwich she had packed, drank her water, and drove to the sale barn outside of town, where she had arranged by phone to look at an outgoing lot before the regular Tuesday auction. The lot was 180 boar cross does and $3, aged out of a collapsed commercial breeding operation, thin and rangy and of wildly mixed quality, with ear tags that had partially come loose and a general air of having been somewhere better that they could no longer quite remember. The livestock auctioneer, a man called Fendler, who had a way of making his voice carry pity and amusement in the same syllable, introduced the lot to the small room of buyers as the saddest herd in 4 counties and offered them at $11 a head for the lot. Marin raised her paddle. Nobody else moved. Fendler looked at her with the kind of expression a man wears when he is trying to decide whether someone is brave or simply uninformed, and when no second bid came, he dropped his gavel and said, "Sold." And there was a sound in the room that was not quite laughter, but was close enough to carry. She paid for the goats $1,980 for the lot, plus a $30 loading fee, and she wrote it in the small brown notebook she kept in her shirt pocket. The arithmetic of what remained was not comforting. She had $1,990 left, a half-tank of diesel, and 83 acres of rock and juniper, and a penciled notation from 1931. She loaded the goats herself, with the help of a boy who worked the chutes, and said nothing, and drove them to the ledge as the sun went low and orange over the western ridge. The next morning, Dry Willow got its first look at Marin Solis and her goats when she drove through town for fence staples and a 50-pound sack of loose mineral. She heard the commentary from two men outside the co-op, delivered loudly and without any effort to lower their voices. One of them said someone had paid cash for the ledge and filled it with culls and was already looking to go broke. And the other one said he supposed that was one way to burn through an inheritance, and they were still talking when she carried her staples to the truck and drove back out. She wrote none of that in her notebook. It was the kind of account that kept its own record. The first 3 months on the ledge were an education in how wrong she had been about the things she thought she knew, and how right she had been about the one thing that mattered. She had kept goats as a girl, a small handful of brush clearers on her grandmother's quarter-acre in Tucson, but she had never managed a herd of 180 on terrain that demanded she understand drainage, browse cycles, and supplemental feed rotations all at once. Well, she strung 2 miles of woven wire fence alone, one post at a time, hauling the equipment by hand up grades that punished her every morning. She lost 3 dozen the first month to what the vet, a lean young woman named Celestine, who drove out from the county seat without complaint, diagnosed as a combination of exhaustion and a copper deficiency in the soil. Marin added it to her notebook. The notebook grew dense. She did the arithmetic every Sunday night by lantern light. Her costs ran to $60 a week in mineral and hay supplement and diesel for her generator. Her income was zero. She had sold nothing. She told herself she was inside the time a thing takes before it becomes itself, and she was not sure she believed it, but she said it the way her grandmother had said grace, not because you were certain of the answer, but because the act of saying it was its own kind of discipline. The ledge was hard and strange and beautiful in a way that required you to be quiet to see it. The goats, for their part, seemed to understand the land more quickly than she did. They fanned out along the limestone shelf each morning with a purposefulness that she began, very slowly, to track. It was in the 6th week that she first noticed where the oldest and most deliberate doe in the herd, a heavy-shouldered animal she had not yet named because she was resisting the impulse, consistently led the others in the last hour of daylight. The doe, whose ear tag read 44, moved to the same lower depression on the limestone shelf each evening and stood there. She did not browse. She simply stood, with her broad face lowered, and breathed. Marin watched her for 4 evenings before she climbed down to the depression herself. The rock there was a different temperature. There was no surface moisture, no visible seep. But the rock was cooler, and the lichens on its underside were a different and darker color than the surrounding stone. As though they were fed by something the surface did not show. She wrote the coordinates in her notebook, measured the temperature differential with a cooking thermometer she had salvaged from a box, and noted that the differential was 9 degrees. She did not let herself be excited. She said to herself, in her grandmother's voice, "Do not spend a coin you have not yet held in your hand." She went back to stringing fence. She named the doe Espinosa. It was in the 8th week that Clementine Ora came to visit. Ora was old. She said 79, and her granddaughter said 83, and neither of them pressed the point, and she had emigrated from Mauritania to New Mexico 4 decades earlier and had come to Dry Willow by a route that was long and layered, and that she summarized only as following the goats, as though they had been ahead of her on the highway. She ran 40 head of West African dwarf goats on 12 acres east of the Valley Road, and was regarded by the Valley with a mixture of respect and bafflement, which is how most communities treat someone who has been right too many times to be dismissed, but who they cannot quite categorize. She arrived at the ledge in a dented blue pickup, parked it at the base of the slope, and climbed to where Marin was working a fence post without being invited, which was how she did most things. She looked at the land for a long time before she looked at Marin. She watched Espinosa and the other does moving along the shelf. She said nothing for several minutes. Then she said, in the accented and softly cadenced English she had arrived at through French and Hassaniya Arabic and 2 decades of New Mexico neighbors. The goat does not search for water where there is no water. She has already found it. You have not found it yet. There is a difference. Marin set her post driver down. Ara said, the land keeps everything it has ever had. It does not give. It only allows. You must learn to be allowed. She looked at Marin carefully and said, you have been thinking like a driller. Think instead like a root. Marin asked her what that meant in practical terms. Ora told her to follow the doe at last light, not the hour before last light and not the hour after, but the last quarter hour before dark, when the temperature differential would be greatest and the doe would be most direct. She said roots do not try. They simply go where the water already is. Marin followed Ara's instruction for 3 evenings. On the 3rd evening, Espinosa led the group to a different point on the shelf, one Marin had not previously marked, and stood with her nose nearly touching a vertical crack in the limestone face that was no wider than 2 fingers. Marin put her own palm against the crack. The air moving from it was 20 degrees cooler than the evening air. It smelled of deep earth and mineral and something ancient and clean. She sat on the limestone and thought for a long time. She was not excited. She was something quieter than excited. She wrote in her notebook, possible fracture access. Seep below. Temperature differential. 20 degrees. Espinosa, certain. It took her 4 weekends of careful hand-boring with equipment she could not really afford to rent, following the fracture line downward to the limestone before she struck water. It was not a gusher or a dramatic event. It was a slow and steady darkening of the drill bit's return, a scent of mineral water rising through the bore, and then, at 19 feet, a flow rate that her borrowed gauge measured at 40 gallons per minute. She sat on the rock and was quiet for a while. She thought of Espinosa. She thought of the surveyor Espinosa, dead these many decades, who had written possible seep zone in pencil in 1931 and been ignored. She wrote in her notebook, quote, 40 GPM confirmed. Do not spend a coin you have not yet held in your hand. Beneath that, she wrote a different kind of arithmetic. The future kind. The kind that frightened her with its size. She capped the well temporarily, said nothing to anyone, and went about her business as though nothing had changed on the ledge. She let the town go on pitying her. She let it go on laughing, which it did with diminishing energy but no less frequency, particularly after the spring auction at Fendler's barn, where a rancher named Beaumont, who ran the largest conventional cattle operation in the valley on irrigated perennial grass, made a show of offering to buy her goats for $12 a head so she could cut her losses and go home. His wife, standing beside him, was kind enough to look at the floor. Marin thanked him for the offer and said she thought she would hold on a while. That got a laugh too. Beaumont was the kind of man who found laughter an agreeable way to end a conversation. The silent child arrived that summer, a boy named Carl Whitmore, 9 years old, who belonged to a family on an adjacent parcel that struggled with a series of misfortunes too layered and too private to inventory. He appeared at the fence one morning without announcement and watched Marin work. She did not send him away. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and within 2 weeks he was following Espinosa with the same solemn attention Marin had learned to bring to the task. He named each animal in the herd within a month, working from his own system of observation, assigning names that were always accurate to some quality of the animal. The doe with the persistent curiosity became Question. The eldest buck with the unhurried authority became Thursday. The young doe, who always browsed to the east, became. Marin wrote his names in her notebook, next to her own numbers. She gave him lunch when he was there at noon, which was most days. He never asked her questions. She did not have answers to, which made him the most comfortable company she had found in the valley. It was the following October, 10 months after her arrival, that the outside verdict was delivered. A woman named Reyes, who operated a small artisanal cheese operation out of Santa Fe, and had heard about the ledge herd through a network that connected to a network in a way Marin had not engineered and did not entirely understand, drove out on a Tuesday without calling ahead. She asked to taste the milk from 3 of the does. She was quiet while she tasted. Then she said, "Who is your buyer?" Marin said she did not have one. Reyes put down the small glass and said, "You do now," and named a price per gallon that was 2.5 times what the regional cooperative paid for commercial goat milk, and said she would take everything the herd produced at that rate on a 30-day contract with the intent to make it a year. She attributed the quality to the browse, the juniper, and native forbs on the limestone shelf, and to something mineral in the water which she could not name, but could taste. Marin thanked her, signed the agreement with the pen Reyes produced, and walked her back to her car. When Reyes had driven away, Marin sat on the tailgate of her truck and opened her notebook and wrote the new arithmetic at the bottom of the page, and then sat for a long time in the kind of quiet that is not emptiness, but its opposite. She told no one. She was banking the coal, keeping it low and orange under the ash. Not because she was secretive by nature, but because she understood that the valley was not yet ready to hear what the ledge had become, and that timing in a community was not so different from timing on the land. You waited for the conditions to make the thing possible. She paid her debts. She bought the equipment she had been doing without. She began developing the spring properly, installing a cistern and a gravity-fed distribution system that could, if she chose, supply water beyond the boundaries of her own land. She noted that the aquifer the fracture accessed, based on the flow rate and the mineral profile, was substantially larger than anything her 83 acres accounted for. She noted this in her notebook and did not discuss it with anyone except Ora, who listened and said, "The root does not own the water. The water permits the root. Remember this when you are decided, not before." The drought announced itself the following May, with a sky that was clear, in a way that felt like an absence rather than a presence, as though the clouds had been postponed and someone had forgotten to reschedule them. By June, the valley's conventional operations were in crisis. The irrigation district's allocation was cut to 40%. The perennial grass that Beaumont ran his cattle on went khaki and brittle. The creek that most of the smaller farms relied on for stock water dropped to a trickle by the first week of July, and to nothing by the third. The heat was the open-door furnace kind that does not relent at night, but only moderates slightly, so that your body never recovers its baseline, and every morning begins at a deficit. The ledge was different. The spring flowed at its measured 40 gallons per minute, regardless of what the sky was doing, because it was fed not by surface accumulation, but by the deeper fracture system in the limestone, which drew from a recharge zone 40 miles to the northeast that had received normal precipitation. The goats browsed the juniper and the desiccation-resistant native shrubs that the drought barely troubled. The milk kept coming. Marin sold to Reyes and paid her accounts, and watched the valley dry from her limestone shelf, without satisfaction and without fear. It was in the third week of July that Aldrich first appeared. He came in a company truck with Consolidated Range Company on the door in discreet gold lettering, and he was pleasant and specific and warm in a way that took skill to produce. He sat at Marin's outdoor table, accepted the water she poured him, and laid out a purchase offer for the ledge that was comprehensive and generous and structured to close within 72 hours. He represented it as a kindness, given the severity of what the valley was facing and her own presumably fragile position. She told him she appreciated his time and that she would not be selling. He nodded, as though he had expected this, and told her the offer would remain open, and thanked her for the water. He came back 2 weeks later with a higher number and a different argument, which was that the valley would be better served by institutional management of the spring, a resource, he said, with a kind of emphasis that revealed he knew precisely what the spring was and what it yielded, than by individual decisions made without the benefit of broader expertise. She told him that her decisions were made with the benefit of the expertise she had, which she found sufficient. He smiled and said she was to be admired, and drove away. He came back a third time in early August, and this time he did not come alone. He brought with him a man from the county water board and a printed summary of a statute that he characterized as allowing for emergency acquisition of water rights in a declared disaster zone, and he said he was not threatening but wanted her to understand her situation fully. He said he had filed a preliminary application on behalf of Consolidated Range Company with the State Engineer's Office for appropriation of the spring's output under emergency provisions, and that a determination could be made within 60 days. He named the flow rate, the well depth, and the mineral profile. He named them precisely. He named them exactly as they appeared in Marin's notebook, which she had never shared with anyone except Aura. And she had not shared those numbers with Aura, only the general fact of the water. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Those are interesting numbers, Mr. Aldrich. Did you get them yourself?" He said there were public records on file, which was not an answer. She thanked him for coming, and said she would be at the county seat in the morning. Cal was sitting on the fence post 20 feet away, as he often was in the early evening. He had heard the numbers. He looked at Marin when Aldridge's truck had gone and said, "He knew the depth?" Marin nodded. Cal said, "You didn't file that?" Marin said, "No, I didn't." Cal said nothing else, but climbed down from the fence and went home with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged in the particular way of a child who has added something to the account he is keeping. She went to the county seat in the morning and had a conversation with an attorney she had identified 3 months earlier, during the quiet period when she had known the water was there and known it would eventually matter. The attorney confirmed that the emergency appropriation statute Aldridge had cited was real but narrow, and that its application required a showing that the current rights holder was either unable or unwilling to make the resource available to the public, and that a prior offer of public access, documented in writing and delivered before the filing, would substantially complicate the application. The attorney said, if you make a public offer before the determination date, the statutory basis for emergency acquisition collapses. Marin said she understood. She asked how long she had. The attorney said the clock started with Aldridge's filing, which had been submitted 11 days ago, so she had 49 days remaining. Marin thanked her, paid the retainer from the account that Reyes's payments had made possible, and drove back to the ledge. It was a Thursday in the middle of August, 17 days after Aldridge's filing, when Beaumont came to her gate. He came in his truck without his wife. In the afternoon, and he sat in the truck for a moment before he got out, which suggested the walk from the cab to the gate was the hardest part. He had lost 40% of his herd to trucking costs and forced sale in the previous 3 weeks. His wells were down to 8 gallons per minute and dropping. He took off his hat when he reached the gate, which Marin noted and did not comment on. And he said that he had heard, he did not say where, but the valley had ears, that she had water on the ledge that was holding up through the drought, and he wanted to know if she would sell him access. He named a price that was fair by his lights, and probably represented more cash than he had available without borrowing. He said he needed enough to water 200 head for the next 60 days. He said he was sorry for the things that had been said. He did not specify the things. She understood that the apology was the harder part of the conversation, and that he had done the harder part before the ask, which she respected. She told him she was not going to sell him access, because selling individual access was not what she had in mind. She told him she was planning to bring the valley in together at a flat rate. She would explain when she had everyone in one place, and that he was welcome to tell the others that a meeting was being planned. He put his hat back on and said he would do that, and he stood for a moment at the gate with his hands on the top rail, looking at the limestone shelf and the goats moving across it in the late afternoon light, and he said, "I was wrong about the goats." She said she knew. He drove home. Aura came to the ledge that evening as though she had been informed, though no one had called her. She sat with Marin at the outdoor table in the cooling air and drank tea and said nothing for a while. Then she said, You are decided. Now Maren said she was. Ora said, the root does not own the water. The water permits the root. You have remembered this? Maren said she thought she was only just beginning to understand it. Otwara said that was the right time to act on an understanding when it was still becoming itself rather than after it had set hard. She looked at the goats settling for the night along the limestone and said, Espinosa knew. Maren said, she always knew. She was just waiting for me to follow. The meeting was on a Saturday at the end of August, at the Dry Willow Grange Hall, which was the largest enclosed space in the valley, and which was full for the first time in recent memory, with folding chairs borrowed from 2 churches and still not enough seats. Maren had sent word through Beaumont and through Cal's family, and through the network that found its way into every corner of the valley within 3 days. She had also written by certified mail to Aldridge and to the Consolidated Range Company's regional office, notifying them of the meeting, which she described as a public forum on water access, open to all interested parties. She was not required to do this. She did it anyway because she wanted Aldridge in the room. He was there in his linen shirt standing at the back with the water board representative. He looked comfortable, which was how he was trained to look. Maren stood at the front of the room without notes. Cal sat in the second row with his mother, who had come in a dress she did not often have occasion to wear. Yura sat in the front row with her granddaughter and looked as though she had seen this kind of meeting before in some form, which she probably had. Maren explained the spring. She explained it plainly, with numbers, including the flow rate and the tested capacity and the infrastructure she had built and what it could supply. She explained that she was proposing to open water access to every agricultural operation in the valley at a rate of $1 per animal per month for the duration of the drought emergency, which she characterized not as a price for the water, but as a contribution toward the labor and maintenance the distribution required, because the water itself was not hers to sell. She said the application process was simple, a signed form, and the first month's payment held in a separate account that would be audited by a committee of 3 valley residents of the group's choosing. She said the arrangement would remain in place until the drought broke and the valley's conventional water sources recovered, and then it would be revisited together. There was a silence. Then Aldridge spoke from the back, and his voice was smooth and confident and calibrated to carry authority, and he said that he wanted to note for the record that Consolidated Range Company had a pending application before the state engineer that the group should be aware of before committing to any arrangement because the legal picture was complex, and that Consolidated had the capital and the infrastructure expertise to manage this resource at a regional scale that would benefit not only Dry Willow Valley, but the adjacent communities. He said that Ms. Solis's proposal, while admirable in spirit, reflected the limitations of individual management and that the community deserved professional stewardship of a resource this significant. He said the flow rate of 40 gallons per minute at 19 feet depth, with the measured mineral profile, was something that deserved serious institutional attention. He said all this in a voice that had been made for rooms like this one. Maren let him finish. Then she said, Mr. Aldridge, you mentioned the depth and the flow rate and the mineral profile. Could you tell the group where you got those figures? He said there were records on file. She said there were no public records of that well. She said she had not filed any. She said the only written record of those numbers that existed outside her own notebook was in a report that had been commissioned by Consolidated Range Company, which would have required a physical assessment of her property without her knowledge or consent, and that she had a date-stamped photograph of a bore site on the edge of her property, adjacent to the boundary with the county easement that she had discovered in June and had not understood at the time. She said she understood it. Now she said she was not making an accusation in this room. She said she was noting a fact, and that the fact was available. To the state engineer's office, to the county attorney, and to the water board representative who was standing next to Mr. Plight. Aldridge right now, and who might want to consider whether his presence in this room constituted a conflict of interest given the pending application. The water board representative stepped sideways away from Aldridge, which was not a formal legal act, but was nevertheless a verdict of a kind. Aldrich's composure held for a moment and then reorganized itself into something harder and less warm. He said the company would be pursuing its rights through the proper channels. She said she was confident of that. He left the room, and the water board representative left with him, though 2 feet further to the left than when he had entered. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then a woman near the back said, $1 a head, she said. Marin said, yes. The woman said, and you're not taking anything for the water itself? Marin said, I don't own it. I found it. There's a difference. There was another quiet, a different quality of quiet, the kind that has something being reconsidered in it. Beaumont stood up from his folding chair, and he stood for a moment without saying anything, and then he said, I'll take the form. That broke something open in the room, and 20 people moved at once. Cal sat in his chair and watched, with his hands folded in his lap, and his face showing the particular satisfaction of someone who had known an outcome before it arrived. Wara did not move toward the forms. She waited until the room had thinned, and then she came to Marin and stood beside her and said nothing for a while. Then she said, the root does not own the water. The water permits the root. She put one hand briefly on Marin's arm. She said, you were permitted. Marin said she thought she was only beginning to understand what that meant. Aura said, yes. That is why you will stay. The consolidated application was withdrawn 6 weeks later, after the county attorney opened an inquiry into the unauthorized bore site, and a regional journalist wrote a piece that was read beyond the valley's boundaries. No charges were filed, which was the kind of outcome that satisfies almost no one and nevertheless constitutes a form of justice. The drought broke in October, in the way droughts sometimes break, not gradually but all at once, with 3 days of rain that came in off the west with the kind of authority that makes you understand why old peoples prayed. The creek came back. The irrigation district restored its full allocation. The valley's conventional operations began their slow recovery. The spring on the ledge continued to flow at 40 gallons per minute, because aquifers are not interested in what happened above them. The water access arrangement continued through the winter by the community's own vote at a reduced rate, because several of the smaller operations had not recovered enough to adjust upward, and because Marin had proposed the reduction herself. The committee of 3 that managed the account reported at the January meeting that the fund had covered all maintenance costs and produced a surplus of $412, which Marin proposed be applied to repairs on the Grange Hall roof, which had been failing for 2 years. Nobody voted against it. The herd grew, not in the frantic way of something overextended, but in the steady way of something, living inside its appropriate conditions. Espinosa, in the early days of November, led the herd to the same depression on the limestone shelf where she had always led them, and stood there in the cooling air with her face lowered, patient as a root, unbothered by any of it. Cal was there to see her, as he usually was. He sat on the limestone with his notebook. He had taken to carrying one, and wrote her name at the top of the page, and then sat quietly and watched the herd settle for the evening, and the light go thin and golden over the ridge. Marin stood at the edge of the shelf and wrote in her own notebook the final arithmetic of the year. 183 does. $4, 11 months of Reyes contracts, 47 valley operations on access, 40 gallons per minute, and $1. She looked at the numbers for a long time. They were not the numbers of wealth, though they were no longer the numbers of peril. They were the numbers of something that had found its appropriate size and was living inside it. She thought of her grandmother, who had said grace not because you were certain of the answer, but because the act of saying it was its own discipline. She thought of Espinosa, the doe, and Espinosa, the surveyor, and the penciled notation from 1931 and the 93 years it had taken for someone to follow the instruction. She thought of Ara's voice, soft and accented and exact. The land keeps everything it has ever had. It does not give, It only allows. You must learn to be allowed. She closed the notebook. She closed the notebook. The valley below was darkening, its lights coming on one by one in the early evening. The lights of families who had water for their stock and hay in their barns, and who had, in the way of communities that have been frightened and have recovered, grown slightly more careful and slightly more curious about their neighbors than they had been before the summer. Not transformed, because communities do not transform in a season, but adjusted the way a plant adjusts toward available light, toward the conditions that make continuation possible. Espinosa moved along the shelf with her unhurried authority, and the herd moved with her, as it always did. And the limestone held the warmth of the long day in the particular way of limestone, slowly, and for a long time, and the fracture in the rock breathed its cool and mineral breath upward into the evening air, as it had been doing since long before anyone put a name to this valley or drew its boundaries on a map or wrote a penciled notation in a survey book in 1931. The water had always been there. It had been permitting the right route for a very long time. It had simply been waiting, the way things that are certain of themselves can afford to wait, for someone quiet enough and patient enough and still enough to hear it. Maren walked back to the house as the last light left the ridge. She put her notebook on the table, put the kettle on, and sat in the chair by the window that looked out over the ledge. And she was home in the way that takes a year and back-breaking labor and a penciled notation and a doe with an old surveyor's name and an elder woman's aphorism and a child with a notebook and an underground river and one hard season to earn, and is thereafter simply where you are, as natural and as settled, as a root in limestone, as water finding its way down.